Hello, welcome to Enlightning. So happy to have you here today. We're here today with Kapil Thangavelu, who's going to teach us about Cloud Custodian. Kapil, tell us about yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Kapil Pankavelu. I am the creator and lead maintainer of Cloud Custodian and the co-founder and CTO of Stacklet.
Awesome. I'm so excited. We always get someone super cool to teach us about a thing, but I think it's pretty rare for us to get the actual creator of a project to teach. So I really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us today, especially because you're on vacation right now.
I
Yeah,
am.
some
Taken some time in Barbados to enjoy some surf and sand and fresh air because I live in DC and the Canadian smoke fires have changed the air quality significantly.
Yeah. That's like I know in California they have fires all the time, but is it relatively new to have smoke from fires in on the East Coast? Yeah.
This is the first year I've ever seen it, and it's been sort of ongoing, intermittent for several months from Chicago to New England to down south to DC, where I am at.
Wow. My brother moved from the Bay Area to Columbus, Ohio, partly to get away from the smoke, and then he said the smoke followed him. But quick question about your vacation. How do you like to spend your time on vacation? Are you chock full of vacation activities, or are you like a nothing on the agenda kind of person?
Some days definitely nothing. Definitely been a little bit action packed this trip. Apparently George Washington came and stayed in Barbados for a little while, so there's a whole tour that I did with that yesterday, and
Wow,
doing some snorkeling with turtles and shipwrecks on Saturday, and
that's
doing some
cool.
paddleboarding later today after this. So
Can you
a little bit action packed.
imagine? Yeah, that's super cool. That the turtles is and shipwrecks is especially compelling to me. And I'm also just thinking how funny it is. Like someone's life was deemed so important by our society that they just went on basically a vacation, and now other people on their vacation are retracing George Washington's trip. You know, like
Pretty much. He was only here 7 weeks, so I don't know why they call it his house. It's a little bit strange, but it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site for other
oh,
reasons.
really?
But
I do gravitate toward UNESCO things. That's super cool. All right, so let's get down to business. I would love to hear those of y'all in chat. If you're quiet today, if you want to speak up, tell us hello and where you're visiting from, or if you want to dig in, especially more, tell us like what right now is your strategy for managing your cloud footprint on your infrastructure. What do you do? How do you prevent someone from running, what did you say, machine learning loads and then forgetting about them and causing your company tons of money and strife? And what I want to hear from you while I move behind the light board, Kapil, is you said you've been in the open source, you've been working in open source since the 90s. What was the night? That's I was still in high school. Tell me about what open source was like back then, please. And I'm gonna go behind the light board.
it was much smaller. It felt a little bit like a little bit more fringe, let's say, than it is today. There were a lot of great language communities, Perl, Python, Tickle, but there was also big commercial notions like Java and WebLogic. Like how you built a web application was you were probably going to pick a commercial middleware stack. Versus today, I feel like it has gone from sort of that to de facto open source around all the software we build from front end to back end. We rely on core open source technologies to build that. Uh, in the late 90s, that was less familiar for a lot of organizations. I got into some of the open source application server space, Zope, which is a Python web app server, and started off doing internships around and building out of like my college student to student portal, and just sort of never looked back. I think once I went from I think my revelation was actually installing Linux for the first time. I actually think I tried various distributions of Debian and some Morel and SUSE. I think I tried them all at some point.
Yeah.
But going from a place where you couldn't, like a commercial compiler, Borderland or Visual Studio, Visual Microsoft C++, to sort of Linux and open source, it was like, oh, I can go read the source. I can go figure out why it's not working or what that error message
Oh, it's
actually means.
super
And it was sort of
empowering.
revelation, totally.
Yeah.
And I
I
just
want to
never looked back from that point.
interrupt you for just a moment and say hello to some folks. We have a friend here from Singapore. Hi, Ronak. Thank you for coming. And we have Sanchit too, who's a senior Oracle Cloud architect. So maybe you're one to answer a question from before, like what are you doing right now to manage your cloud footprint? All right, keep on telling us about your story. I'm not quite done with my side of things.
No worries. And so, yeah, I started off in that ecosystem. Started going to some conferences around various projects, and sort of got to be on the ground of some of these projects. Another significant project, sort of starting off the Cloud content management server, and sort of continued on through speaking at O'Reilly conferences, and it's been got into cloud early 2000s, sorry, mid 2000s, when EC2 didn't have persistent disks, and it was to start off with queues and object storage, and so both watching that journey of open source to becoming sort of de facto, like going from Oracle databases to Postgres, going from SQL Server to MySQL, and sort of seeing that progression across all ends of the stack, all ends of software development, from your database stores to your front end JavaScript, seeing that become sort of the de facto on how everyone builds software.
I've
Nowadays, you wouldn't reach out for a middleware commercial application server, and more than likely, or Nginx and Apache would be more than good enough for most loads that you're trying to do.
so I've in the moment, did you have a sense of, oh, open source is going to be a thing. This is going to be big, or did you just have? Could you? Did you have any premonition it would become what it is today?
I did, in the sense that it felt like a better way of developing software.
Uh-huh.
That the If you have a large enough community of contributors, like the diversity of use cases that they're going to solve against are going to greatly exceed sort of the brain trust of a single organization. Being able to tap into sort of a global community of users that are all trying to solve different problems really can sort of create the right conditions for that software to be flexible enough to be used in many different contexts.
That makes a ton of sense. I just love the community aspect. All right. I'm ready to move on to Cloud Custodian specifically. And so those people who watch the show regularly know the first question I love to ask is, what was the world like before Cloud Custodian? Like what problem or problems existed that caused you to feel like Cloud Custodian needs to exist and you want and you to motivate you to create it?
So that goes back to, I had just started at Capital One,
Mm-hmm.
and they were, a large U.S. financial institution, and they had made a decision to go all in on cloud,
Okay.
as and open source as well, and you know, getting in the trenches and moving some of the first apps to production in AWS was interesting, because in a large regulated institution, you've got all these different sort of challenges and risks that you have to cover off on, and that I looked at how that was being done, and I realized that we were inhibiting our own productivity. That we were writing one-off scripts to deal with tag compliance or encryption at rest, and all of those one-off scripts weren't really well tested. They weren't really well operated, and they were labor intensive to produce. And as we looked at the hundreds of services that were available to us from the cloud provider, that wasn't going to keep pace with the rate of change.
Mm-hmm.
So Cloud Custodian came about as, initially it was actually just targeted at sort of tag management, but the goal was to try to unify all of those one-off scripts into a common rules engine that we could apply to across a diverse set of problems, to use a DSL to model that problem instead of having to write one-off code. And by doing that, we were able to empower developers to move faster because we were able to cover off compliance on different services much more quickly. We were able to, and it was also much more readable. Like, I think that one of the things you learn in open source is that you read code a lot more than you write it. And I think that's generally true for software engineering in general. And so having policies that were on a higher level DSL that could be read by non-developers, read by your auditors or security analysts, or also the application developers who may not be familiar with that language, but it was readable to them, made it hugely productive because they knew what rules they were beholden to. And different people could assess, hey, what are we doing in that particular account or that particular environment, and they just could just read the rules. And then, of course, treating it as code, being able to treat our policies and our governance in the same way that we do our infrastructure provisioning, as an as code approach, where we check it in, we can do code review on it. Also, yielded a lot of benefits. I look back at that time, and there were, we had, as an organization, we had bought lots of tools that, ended up being like big walls of red, some security checking tool that the security team saw, but, how did that information get back to the developers? And it was like, well, we have to go up the org chart on one side and come back down on the other side to get to developers through many layers of indirection. And so Custodian took the philosophy of, why don't we just notify the developers in real time as they do something wrong directly, as opposed to trying to, and also taking up a philosophy of, let's fix these things at scale. These problems are there's too many of them, and they're too ephemeral to wait on a long chain organization reporting process. So instead, say you put a database in the internet, custodian policy could respond in real time, shut the database down, send you a Slack message or an email saying, hey, you put a database in the internet, it's okay, we fixed it for you. Here's the corporate policy on doing it right in the future. So it's really about trying to make sure we could empower developers, because you're starting your cloud journey. You're learning so many new things as an organization, and you want to empower people to pick the best tools that are available. Be that Terraform or Pulumi or CloudFormation or whatever tools may make sense, or using Ansible or Shell script. That's okay too. Meeting the org where they are, but ensuring that whatever tools that developers are choosing, that the organization policies are still in effect.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing, before Cloud Custodian, the problems, like policy was inhibiting productivity. And you said compliance a lot of the times, or maybe governance, and I just grouped all of the security, everything under policy. Is that accurate to do that in terms of just summarizing the problem?
Yeah, we generally regard governance as sort of a big tent. It's just, if I was to summarize, it's how can you be well managed in the cloud? And if you look at what the pillars of that tent is, it's, security is a fundamental component, cost optimization, operations, compliance, and all those things sort of form sort of the big tents on being well managed. So you want to make sure that you've got your DR strategy set up and you're taking backups correctly. You want to make sure you're being, your application is highly available from an operations perspective. On the security side, it might be making sure that, you don't have VMs with elevated IAM access directly available on the internet, or making sure that all of your data is encrypted at rest with customer managed keys. On the cost side, it might be making sure that you're not, having underutilized resources causing waste, or unused resources causing waste on your bill. And all that sort of, how does an organization be effective and well managed in the cloud?
So is it accurate to say that policy was inhibiting productivity, or do you think governance would be a better word?
I think it was the implementation of how to go about policy, and the tools that were available at the time. The tools that were available at the time tended to be reporting tools, and they tended to be significantly latency for actually finding issues. So being able to find problems in real time and correct problems and drive the behavior change for an organization, was sort of the key aspects on that. Yeah. And then in terms of like how the policies were implemented, I just went through on a tool comparison, but the other way was that people were writing one-off scripts, and that approach didn't scale well in terms of productivity and efficiency, because for many of these organizations, this is undifferentiated lifting from their actual business value that they deliver to their own customers.
So I'm not elaborating about the real-time feedback, because I feel like we're going to get into that once we get into Cloud Custodian. So what I'm like, back when Cloud Custodian was formed, orgs were just at the beginning of the cloud journey. So there was just a lot to figure out from the start. And then in order to make sure orgs weren't like the folks weren't doing too much, like manage, like we talked about the machine learning wasn't around there, but running huge workloads, like people were using scripts, one-off scripts for that. And it's not scalable, and overall policy was inhibiting org productivity. So that's something you were experiencing when you were at Capital One, you said, and you're like, there needs to be a tool for this. So you created Cloud Custodian. So what is Cloud Custodian?
So Cloud Custodian is a rules engine for helping you manage your cloud footprint. And it consists of a high-level YAML DSL. A given policy and custodian is something that targets a particular resource. And then, like, say, EC2 instances or TCP object storage buckets. And then you apply an arbitrary set of filters to those resources to find the interesting set. And we support all kinds of rich filtering, arbitrary ands, ors, nots, blocks, nested, and of course, discovering relationships between those resources. So you find the interesting set through a set of filters, and then you take a set of actions on them.
I love this. It's moving way too fast for what I can capture. I got the first sentence of that, but I think like the base of it is, and we'll get into how it works, but the Cloud Custodian is a rules engine that helps you manage your cloud resources. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Great. Let me get this, and then we'll talk about how it works. So let's talk about what it consists of, is what you started to go into next. And we have a couple comments that I want to address. So we have, from where can we learn VMware Tanzu? If anyone can guide, thanks in advance. There's a Tanzu Developer Center. That would be a great place to start. And we also have a hello. Hello, thanks so much for being here. All right, so Cloud Custodian is a rules engine that helps you manage your cloud resources. So now we're going to say what it consists of.
So a custodian operates on sort of what's a policy level, and a policy consists of four things. Well, I guess five things, but I'm going to leave off on two of those for a little bit later. The basic policy consists of a resource, a type of resource that you want to find or want to operate on. And that could be, any type of cloud resource. That could be a AWS EC2 instance, an Azure VM, a Google Cloud Object Storage bucket, or Pub Sub channel. And then a set of filters. So a resource and then a set of filters. The filters let you take sort of the whole population of that resource, and then filter down to the interesting set of them that you want to find. And that could be, show me all of my disk volumes that are not encrypted, or show me all of my VMs that are on the public internet that have elevated IAM access. So it allows for fairly arbitrary filtering to find that interesting set of things. And you can, and that can combine with, and some of those filters are also doing API calls, discovering relationships, checking metrics, etc. So finding that interesting set of things. And then finally, you want to take a set of actions on them. And those actions could be something like stop a VM, or snapshot a disk, or uh, change a security group, or change the service principal or IAM access that resource has. And so those go together, those filters and actions. Go ahead.
Will you repeat the first couple actions you said? You said a couple of nice
Yeah,
simple
so
ones.
it might be like
Snapshot.
stop an instance, stop a VM, snapshot a
Okay.
disk. Um,
Yeah. Great. That's great.
and so these sets of filters and actions go together like Lego bricks, as far as being able to allow you to express policy. Custodian supports hundreds of resources, hundreds of actions, hundreds of filters, and you can sort of apply them in different contexts. So I might take that stop VM action and I might apply it to my development environment for off hours. But I might also use it as a incident response to a security event and say, hey, let's snapshot the disk and stop that instance because it looks like it's got Bitcoin mining or something on it. So being able to reuse this rich vocabulary of filters and actions lets you craft millions of types of policies targeted towards what you need.
So resources plus filters on those resources can equal actions if it's triggered.
Resources filtered out to the interesting set that you take actions on. Yeah.
But the actions happen automatically.
The actions are defined in the policy. So this is,
Mm-hmm.
those three constituents are effectively just different blocks inside of a YAML policy. And so the actions happen on the filtered set of resources, and the resource type defines what you're looking for, and the filters find the interesting set of those things.
Excellent. And then so I like how you've given an example of each of the steps or each of the, yeah. Will you do one more example? And I think you already did this while I was thinking about something else of a big picture from start to finish. Like what's the resource, what filter happens, what action happens, or how it's filtered, what act. Yeah.
Yeah, so I might look for databases that haven't had any, look at databases. So that's my resource. I might define a filter that says, I want to find all the databases that haven't had a connection to them in the last 2 weeks. So effectively the definition of unused. And then I might want to take an action like, hey, well, let's stop them, or let's notify whoever owns this resource that they should look at this because it looks like it's a waste of money for the organization.
So the action, they could be stopped or someone could be contacted. For simplicity's sake, let's just say they're stopped. Yeah? Okay. Filter to the ones, and then those are stopped. Okay.
Generally speaking, we try to emphasize like driving behavior change and notifying people proactively because it's always good to, before you modify someone's resource, to give them some ability to some heads up and some ability to respond.
So I think it's blue. So database is the resource. And then filtered is green. Ones that have had no connection in 2 weeks. That is our filter. And then our action is stopped and admin is notified. Cool.
Now,
Excellent.
the two additional parts of the policy, which I didn't mention in this context, are really about how we operate. Custodian is integrated into the serverless runtimes of the different clouds that it supports, such that you can do this real time. So the two additional parts are what we call a mode. So Custodian If you don't have a mode, you are sort of operating in our default mode, which is polling. Like we'll go query all the resources. So you can run Custodian itself is just a CLI. You can run it on your desktop. You can run it in CI. You can run it in lots of different compute. Bring your own compute, so to speak. And that default mode will effectively go query the cloud control plane for all the resources of that type, and then run through filters and then actions. Now, we also support doing event-based modes. So you might say, whenever a database is launched, I want to operate on it. And we support maybe a dozen different event-based modes. And this is sort of tied into the underlying capabilities of the different clouds. And if you specify a policy with an event-based mode, when you go to run and custodian that policy on the CLI, Custodian will actually provision a serverless function in that cloud environment, which has the policy content, and it'll also hook up the event-based source for that policy. So in AWS, that might be setting up an event, provisioning a Lambda and an event bridge rule that says anytime somebody launches a database, invoke this policy, invoke this function. And in GCP, that's using Google Cloud Audit Logging to a cloud function, and ditto for Azure as well. So that's sort of our baseline capability of sort of being able to, as API calls are happening in the cloud environment, by using these event-based modes, you're able to sort of introspect those API calls and determine that the result is compliant to your organization policy. So a very common one might be, hey, auto tagging, like, hey, you created a resource that doesn't have a tag. Our organization has a tag policy that everything has to be tagged with its owner. So Custodian can look at the event, the API call, and determine, hey, this was the user that is initiating this API call. Let's go ahead and tag the resource they're creating with their name.
And what's an example? So a database is created with an API call, and then it automatically gets tagged. And then what's an example of a polling mode?
A polling mode is our default, and what it's going to do when you run in CLI is just query the entire set of databases that are in the cloud. So it's going to look at the whole fleet, let's say, of resources, and then do the filtering and then take its actions.
So
and
it
sort
queries.
of stateless. Yes,
Okay.
It queries directly, whereas the event-based modes are mostly sort of more push-oriented, where the event, we set up the cloud to the event source to directly push that to the policy as those changes are happening.
And that allows for real-time enforcement.
Exactly.
Great.
Real-time has different definitions to different people. So GCP, that's on the order of a few hundred milliseconds. AWS, I think P99's, a few seconds. Azure, I think we're like about a minute, if I remember correctly.
Cool. So that's 4, and you said there's one more.
Sorry. We also have this ability called a source, and that's where we get the information for the cloud. And so this tends to be a little bit more advanced and a little bit more niche, but in larger cloud environments, one of the dirty secrets of cloud is the fact that everything's subject to rate limits. So one bad shell script in Jenkins and a hot loop can cause a bad day for people. So to provide for that, because Custodian's used in some extremely large cloud environments, we also support the ability of having pluggability about where you query that information. By default, we're going to talk to the individual service APIs. So if you're talking to VMs in GCP, you're going to talk to the compute service. Now, a source lets us go from the default, which is typically, we call it describe, and it's talking to the native service control plane for that particular resource type, to instead going to the asset inventory source for the different clouds. And so in GCP, that would be Cloud Asset Inventory. In Azure, it's Azure Resource Graph. In AWS, that would be AWS Config. And instead of fetching it directly from the service APIs, which might be under some degree of rate limit or strain that we directly create from a separate index that the cloud providers maintain for those resources themselves.
And what did you say that second way is called?
They're generically called sources. They're different. The default one is called describe across all the providers. The additional ones are cloud provider specific. In
Uh-huh.
AWS, it's AWS config. In GCP, it's Cloud Asset Inventory. In Azure, it's
Okay.
Resource Graph.
So I'm just going to put also there cloud specific ones. So so this is wrapping up a whole series on policy tools and the CNCF. So we've covered Kyverno, OPA, Cube Warden, Cube Armor, Falco, and now you. And what's interesting about this, it seems like, tell me if I'm wrong here. So some of those are at the admission controller layer. Some of those are at the runtime layer, but this seems to be a cloud provider specific, not Kubernetes specific. Yeah. So this is like its own thing. It doesn't really directly
Yeah.
compare to those
So
other tools. Yeah.
it it does and doesn't. I'd say primarily our primary focus is on where the cloud provider that you're running your workloads on. So we're very much focused on giving a native experience for those cloud providers, being able to target the exact attributes of things, and being sort of our bread and butter has always been runtime for the cloud. We also do preventative as far as looking at infrastructure as code assets and running policies directly against Terraform. We do support Kubernetes as far as having a mission controller or both mutating and validating that you can use as a policy enforcement point. But the vast
Interesting.
majority of users are directly going against some of the cloud provider endpoints. And today we support, I think, like 7 or 8 providers. Providers are sort of the source of those resources. We support AWS, Azure, GCP, Oracle recently contributed OCI support, Tencent Cloud, OpenStack, and Kubernetes, and doing infrastructure as code against Terraform. So those are our 8 providers at the moment.
Cool. And
And
I say
most of
hi
that's
to
contributed by a very large community of almost 400 contributors.
nice. Well, some of this stuff I might want to capture, but I want to see what else you have to say. Fuel Snowball's here. Hi, Fuel Snowball. Fuel Snowball, our question of the day is how do you manage your cloud infrastructure? Like how do you make sure crazy workloads don't make the bill go super high? What's your current strategy? So so I'm just trying to understand this tool in the context of the other ones. Is it possible you wouldn't need a tool like Kyverno that does the admission controller level in Kubernetes since this supports Kubernetes? Or would you
You
want to
could.
have both? Yeah.
You potentially will want to do both.
Mm-hmm.
Like our goal with Custodian is to be sort of a policy language across all forms of infrastructure, and that could be from your containers to the underlying infrastructure that those containers are running on, to the load balancers that they're set up on. I'd say that
Mm-hmm.
to date, that like roughly, the vast majority of our users are using Custodian to manage against their infrastructure. We do support Kubernetes, but you we operate in a world where we try to be flexible. And so
Yeah.
if a user's using something for one aspect, that's great. They're solving a problem. So
Yeah.
we want to still help them, with all the other parts of the problem that exist. But yes, could they use Custodian across the full range? That's our goal.
Cool. That's so I'm gonna box this. We have it all. Let me so if a so we got the resource plus filters equal actions. So so then the mode is like basically how are the resources being pulled, right? POLLED. They could be pulled with queries or kind of pushed with events. And then the source is how how are these resources being discovered? And that's happening through the source, right?
Yeah, discovery is a combination of source and mode. Like if you're being pushed,
Okay.
if you're doing an event mode where it's directly subscribing to API calls, then these things are being pushed to you. And so in that context, your discovery is happening through that event stream. Um, and so it's a, there's maybe some nuance there depending on what combination of things you want to do. But typically, mode is, whether or not you want to, when you want to discover, let's say, like, do you want to
Mm-hmm.
discover, at intervals of your choosing on like a periodic basis, or do you want to discover them and sort of as they're happening? And then
Mm-hmm.
sources sort of, I think you said it was, how do you discover, or how do you get the resource?
So this is the how do you get it? Okay. And
And when do you get it?
yeah, when to get resource, how to get resource. Cool. Love it. Great. Now I'm going to box this off. We did it. And where do you think it would be? Where should we take it next? Or where do you want to take it next? I think talking about the
Sorry.
community. Oh, yeah. Were you muted?
Yeah, we could talk about sort of the growth of the community. We could talk about some use cases that people like to address with Custodian. Um,
I think use case.
uh,
So maybe we'll save the community toward the end because then we'll
okay.
have a call to action to join in. Yeah.
Sure.
So let's do use case.
So use cases, Custodian is able to express millions of policies. The, you know, if I was going to look at the four sort of pillars that we outlined for governance, there's a set of cost policies that people want to implement. Go ahead.
Since those pillars have come up twice now, let's get them on the board. They're pillars for like good policy. What
Yeah,
are these
so
pillars?
the
Yeah.
pillars are for good governance, so to speak, or good being well managed in the cloud. And most of the use cases line up to one of these pillars. The pillars are security, um, being well managed. Yep.
In cloud. Four pillars.
So uh,
Okay.
security is sort of a good foundational one.
Excellent.
Operate
I'm listening.
operations as another. Um, Making sure that you're resilient, efficient, that you've got, your load balancers are configured correctly for multi-AZ, or you've got backups out of region, or that your network is correctly configured. So
Okay.
and then cost. So making sure that you're spending your cloud dollars efficiently, that you don't have additional waste, unused resources, underutilized resources, um, and then opportunities around applying like life cycles to object storage to automatically expire stuff, or your container registry to get rid of old versions.
Do you want to say more about security?
Yeah, I mean, so security covers the gamut of overprivileged IAM to network security to a lot of resources.
Access.
Also, yeah, so network access, or access in general,
Yeah.
um, over,
Networks.
and that covers off on sort of network, and a lot of resources embed sort of IAM policies as well. So sorry, network, access, and IAM, identity access management. which
Okay.
might be in
Same
it.
thing.
Yeah, fair
I'll
enough.
put it on there.
Then you can go into things like making sure, encryption at rest, and customer managed keys. And then
Cool.
our, our general philosophy around, oh, sorry, and sorry, let's continue on the thread. And the last one is compliance. Let's say you want to make sure that your infrastructure is compliant to SOC 2 for business reasons, or you're trying to achieve best practices with CIS benchmarks. There's various security compliance standards that are out there, and this is a tool that can help you um, evaluate that and enforce that. So SOC 2, PCI, HIPAA. Now, some portions of these standards, various NIST standards, some portion of these standards are things that you can automate. Some portion of them are like process oriented, which are a little bit different. But so
Is compliance always to do with like some third party? Do organizations create their own compliance, or is it more like HIPAA, like you said, is the one that was familiar from all the stuff you just said, like
so people are most familiar with
regulation?
yeah, people are most familiar with some of the sort of the well-known third-party ones, but almost every
Uh-huh.
organization I've seen has defined their own internal one. The most
Okay.
common example being like a tag standard, and that's a tag standard is interesting because everyone has one and no two are the same. Um, and so, as an example of sort of an internal organization standard, compliance standard.
So what is the difference between an internal organizational compliance standard and governance?
Um, because it's helping you be well managed in the cloud. Like, let's say that you have an internal tag standard that says everything should be tagged with these 5 tags. It's application, it's environment, it's the resource owner, the application team. If you create a resource without that, then that resource is not being well managed and it's out of compliance with your internal standard. And
Uh-huh.
so, from a custodian perspective, that's no different than any other policy that we might try to help an organization achieve compliance or achieve within their environment. Um, the the only real delta between it is the ability to share that knowledge externally, because it won't make sense necessarily for those policies to be out in the world because they're very specific to a particular organization. And the other place that we find that um, policies tend to be very specific to an organization is when they actually go to fix them. Like, so custodian is remediation is sort of a first class part of our tool, and I think we're one of the best tools in the world at remediation. And that's the other place where sort of this ability to specify and customize the behavior to the organization becomes really key, because how you deal with remediation is going to vary based on what environment you're in. And if you're in production, I don't want to terminate the database, or if I'm in development, I might want to do something different, or I might want to let people apply for exceptions. And so being able to source that data from your policy, and being able to customize that workflow. So like it's probably worth just talking about remediation as a separate topic, but
Absolutely. I think what I'm trying to understand is the difference between compliance and governance. I think I understand what compliance is, but then what is governance exactly?
so, and this is, I think these are somewhat arbitrary definitions. Like I
Okay.
said, we typically define governance as sort of that big tent that encompasses all of these things, where governance is that aspect of being well managed in the cloud, and
Okay.
it
Oh,
consists of
so
all these
these,
underlying.
all four of these can be considered together, can be considered governance.
Correct.
Cool. Thank you. So two things have come up that maybe we want to capture on the board. One is like just the sheer scale of everything you're talking about. I think I want a better sense of that because you're talking about millions of policies. You're talking about like all the resources at the resource level, like maybe even like the scalability and like just generally helping me understand the scale. And then at scale, like how is it able to happen efficiently? It seems like it would cost a lot of compute to be able to have pretty granular control or granular policies on such a large scale.
So, I mean, scale custodian operates in, large, and like everything is intended to work down from a mom and pop shop to
Mm-hmm.
some of the largest enterprises on the planet. You know,
Okay.
the go from $100 cloud spend to $1 billion cloud spend, let's say.
Uh-huh.
And in that context, the the scope of the policies is, as you see fit in terms of what policies you want to run in that environment. Now, from a compute perspective, um,
Uh-huh.
event-based policies are, effectively using the serverless runtime, so they're only operating and executing as those changes are happening,
Mm.
and
Okay.
they're specific to the particular changes that you're looking for. So you're not looking at all API calls; you're looking at those that are
Only the
creating an instance.
database related ones. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Or, well, as an example, like you might choose VMs or you might choose object storage, and you're primarily looking at the CRUD events around the control plane itself. So those actually tend to be fairly efficient from a cost perspective. From a compute perspective, on pool-based policies, it really is bring your own compute. So we've
Mm-hmm.
seen people run policies in Kubernetes. We've seen people run policies in Jenkins and Circle CI. We've seen them run them on, both containers and, Graviton different architectures. So really, and on that basis, when we're operating on dedicated compute, we also take advantage of caching. So let's say you have 1,000 policies against the VMs in your provider. We're going to query those VMs once and then run through all the policies for them so that you're not having to refetch them constantly.
Okay. I would like I would like to make a list of, and you've kind of rattled up these off a few times, of all the different it doesn't have to be inclusive of every single thing, but like of all the different places that custodian policies are run. Like you've talked about the major cloud providers, you've talked about Terraform. Um, does that, yeah, I think that would be good to express what I'm trying to express, which is like how huge this thing feels.
So, and for against the runtime, and I probably
Uh-huh.
need to distinguish sort of based on how, like, what you're trying to govern against. If you're
Uh-huh.
governing against the runtime in the cloud, you typically provide your own compute, and that might be, a VM, and it could be a CI, or it could be like it can be different. You can provide your own whatever you see fit. Let's just take the
Mm-hmm.
simple answer. Get a VM and you stick a cron job on it, and that runs your policies. And you're doing policy as code, so you're pulling those policies out from, your Git repository, and then you're running them. Now, so you're primarily paying for the cost of that VM in that context. Now, when
Uh-huh.
you have a policy that's in an event mode, custodian will actually provision that policy as a serverless function in the different cloud providers, and hook up the
Uh-huh.
event sources to it. So in that context, you also have those functions, but those functions are only executing as those events are happening, as those changes are happening.
Uh-huh.
Now, when we talk about things like shift left and being able to analyze Terraform and infrastructure as code assets, there we adopt sort of a different model. It's because it is a different consideration. Like in a runtime, you're focused on sort of finding things and detecting things, taking action on them. In a shift left context, you're really focused on helping the developers and the reviewers um, understand what's wrong with something and how to fix it. So our Terraform integration might be something you run sort of pre-commit on your local laptop, as a developer. Run the policies against your Terraform before you commit. You might, and then of course pre-merge, which is sort of in the CI pipeline. And in that context, on the pre-merge, we're helping not only the developers by like sort of failing in CI, but we're also trying to help the reviewers by directly annotating the pull request, so that the reviewer can see, hey, this line is not compliant with this policy. And so we have direct integration with GitHub and other other code hosting systems to help in that review process. And then of course, finally, pre-deploy, in your CD pipeline with the right variables and context, being able to also evaluate those resources. So those are sort of the, where, when you want to operate on, and where in the development life cycle you want to operate, sort of determine sort of what those types of computes are.
Is shift left different than pre-deploy?
It is the same thing. I mean, it
Okay.
is a DevSecOps, so to speak, or I guess
Mm-hmm.
Gov DevOps or Policy DevOps, um, and that can, that pre-deployment notion is happening on, local laptop pre-commit, NCI and code review pre-merge, and then pre-deploy in your CD pipeline.
Cool. So Cloud Custodian can come into play at different points. Um, I don't even want to say like in a workload lifecycle. Do you consider cloud runtime to be part of the lifecycle of a workload?
Absolutely,
Okay.
100%. That's where the workload actually
Okay.
lives. So that's definitely part of the
Uh-huh.
life cycle. You're gonna have to update that,
Okay.
upgrade it. Yeah. But all problems are easier to fix sort of closer to the source. It's interesting, like some particular problems don't amend themselves very well to doing it in the shift left capacity. Like if you look at cost optimization, for example, you really need the metrics from actually seeing the workload run to be able to determine if it's right sized correctly.
So so Cloud Custodian's good for not only the actual policy enforcement, but also communicating best practices and teaching best practices to anybody who's using the policy, regardless of whether there's an ops person or a developer or anywhere in
Right.
between.
So
Yeah.
right, we're we want the policies themselves to be readable by a wide
Mm-hmm.
and diverse audience, but we also want to drive the notification to the right context. So, especially when the runtime, like we can source who to contact from many different channels. So you can statically define it. You can set up a set of variables around it. You can define it on the resource tag against the account or subscription or project that the resource lives in. And then, as from a channel perspective, we can deliver via email, via Slack, via Teams, via oh gosh, got Splunk, and so the intent is to try to get from a channel perspective to try to get to directly to the developer and do that in real time, so that we're able to respond and notify the responsible party. And that's really about just driving behavior change. Um, in some cases, when we talk about remediation, like, and that might be a good next topic, organizations are always discovering new things in the cloud. So remediation tends to be quite varied. Um, so let's say, as an organization, I just discovered that we shouldn't be using GP2 EBS volumes. We should be using GP3 because they cost less, they're more efficient, and we need to go change that. So we might do something where we set up a real-time policy sort of to stop the bleeding, to stop the net new, and say,
Mm-hmm.
hey, anytime somebody launches one of these things with that old volume type, let's go ahead and, tell them, notify them, hey,
Mm-hmm.
don't do this. And potentially we fix it for them right then and there. And then, but with regards to the existing workflow, the existing fleet, we might have, we might want to take a different approach. We might want to take a workflow where we say, hey, we're going to give everyone a month's grace. Like, we're going to notify people, we're going to give them a month's time to go fix this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't fix it, we'll send them a reminder in like 2 weeks and 1 week out. And then
Mm-hmm.
finally we'll actually stop it. Now that we might allow them to go apply for exceptions for this policy and source
Mm-hmm.
that as before we go take our actions. And our actions might be that, hey, let's go ahead and stop those things. And
Mm-hmm.
we'll again sending notification as we do, and say we're going to go delete these things in another week if you don't apply for an exception. And then we finally
Mm-hmm.
go ahead and terminate it, or they apply for an exception. And so that's sort of like how you deal with sort of the real world around, um, you know, coming up with new policy and dealing with an existing environment and sort of bringing it up to compliance over time.
So you might want to, so remediation varies a lot between orgs. You might want to alert in real time. You can fix it in real time, possibly. Maybe you only send a reminder. Maybe you set a time limit before an action happens. But all the while, the important thing is that Cloud Custodian or you as the administrator is communicating with the user as these things are happening.
Yep.
I see you, Fuel Snobble. What are you saying? Perf and cost optimizations are quite similar, and both are quite hard to test in a non-production environment. What is perf?
Performance, I believe.
Performance. Okay.
As a concept.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Kapil?
I mean, I think they're related. I don't know if I would quite say they're the same. Like a cost optimization might be the fact that you have, 100 EBS volumes that are not attached to any compute. Or they might be that now from a right sizing perspective, if I have a QA environment that's a perf environment, that's a performance testing environment, potentially I don't need to use that environment. That environment doesn't need to be on 24/7 if I'm not testing a release or doing practicing continuous deployment. And so I might apply off hours for that environment. I mean, generally speaking, if you're testing perf in a non-prod environment, you should typically be doing that with some sort of load scale to actually simulate production workload. Now, whether or not you have direct access to the same data sets and there's database anonymization, you're sort of into the specifics on particular application architectures and organization dynamics. From an infrastructure perspective, though, there's different characteristics around if that resource is underutilized, it's underutilized regardless. And there's a question then of, is it actually, if you're not, and that's regardless of whether or not you're load testing it or whatnot. And in that context, it's waste from an organization perspective.
Fuel Salva says, I suppose I intended to write that they are similar to each other and that they're both hard to test in test. Data lake and test 10. Yeah, that's a megabyte versus a petabyte situation.
But in that context, you might be able to do like a more tuned lifecycle policy for the data lake and test. You might be able to say, let's archive things. And that's about sort of what sort of yes, that as a generic problem, there's a question of how do you, that's more of an application consideration that has specific to organizations on how they want to model test data. But, whether or not you have a slice of the data lake just for testing purposes, that's a little bit outside of sort of the governance aspect, and it feels like to more of the application lifecycle and development aspect. But there's different ways to model this depending on sort of what makes sense for the org and what type of data it is. So obviously if it's PII, you might need to deal with data masking and whatnot before you can create a sub slice of your data lake for application testing.
So for me, with this bit of space, there are a couple things. I'm hoping to bring it together into all these pieces feel maybe a little bit disparate. I still want a larger view. So what I'm thinking either is maybe summarize a list of benefits in one place. So maybe I can understand a little bit how to compare to another. Or another idea is maybe to dig into a use case, and that might help solidify it for me. What do you think? Or is there something else you want to get into altogether?
No, I mean, that sounds fine. I think we also table community. Digging into community. Example of, use cases,
okay.
We've been talking about with in chat about sort of, test versus prod environments. And in that context, one use case that can, save significant costs for people is setting up, an off hours environment. Setting up off hours policies on your development and QA environments. And so Custodian supports being able to set up using off hours filters, which are sort of time-based filters, and then actions will sort of stop and resume, and you might apply. So we had used stop as an example action for both security as well as this use case around off hours. In this context, a policy ends up looking like a off hours filter, which defines sort of the time range that you want it to be off, and you might be, you know, this particular time zone, this, these particular days we want to, and these particular hours we want to turn off, inclusive of weekends. And then you want to apply that to the compute and database resources. Which resources we support off hours for and stopping really depends on what the underlying provider allows us to do. Whether or not you can stop a database in a different provider is, sort of specific to that provider's implementation. And so you might stop your auto scaling groups, you might stop your databases, you might stop and all of your VMs, as an example for off hours. And then you can customize that. Like most organizations, span time zones. So different applications might have different off hours needs within a particular environment. You can do this both on an opt-in basis or an opt-out basis. So opt-in is, where the application team chooses to provide a tag, which allows them to, which includes them in the policy filtering. Or you might choose to have an opt-out basis where if they don't say anything, then they're default included. And, between compute and database, this is, which typically form roughly 80% of most application costs. This can be a significant savings if you're turning them off for like, assuming, let's say, a 10-hour work week, or sorry, a 10-hour work day, or actually if you want to do an 8-hour work day, you can look at the total amount of time in the week and understand that that's a significant cost realization versus not turning off those development environments.
Super cool. I love that. Do you want to say something about the remediation piece? Like, what would it look like in this use case if someone tries to use their compute and it's turned off?
So we typically allow people to provide additional policies to say, user wants to turn something on. So, I mean, remediation is typically, as a language, as a phrase, is something that we typically use around taking action on a resource due to non-compliance. In the context of off hours, we're taking action as part of the normal functioning, let's say. So it's not something that I would typically term as a remediation case. But in terms of customization of off hours to enable sort of, hey, I need to work late tonight. I got a deadline. I can either for opt-out or for opt-in or opt-out, I can simply apply a tag to the resource so that the off hours doesn't happen, or say it did turn something off, and I do want it to come back on because I still want to use it this particular day. I can have a policy which simply says, as soon as somebody adds a tag and in that real-time response, let's go ahead and turn it back on. They want to use it still, so let's turn it back on.
Cool. Yeah, I guess instead of saying remediation, I guess really what I wanted was like how it's communicating in the human readable way that we were kind of talking about before, that didn't exist before a tool like Cloud Custodian existed.
Yeah. So, I mean, in this case where there's always an organizational aspect to sort of defining policies and, communicating that out there's an aspect of this that's out of hand, let's say, being able to communicate out what your policies are to the rest of your stakeholders within your org. In the context of off hours, that's typically already been communicated out that this is now active in the environment. You typically start off on an opt-in basis. If you're doing opt-out, then you out of band should have clearly communicated to the application owners in that environment that this is going to happen. This is what to be aware of. This is how you can opt out of it, and then the rest of this from a developer visibility perspective is typically just done through common tags on a resource. So labels, tags exist throughout providers, and so they can directly see those interactions. They can apply for. That's also the basis for their opt-in or opt-out. It's also potentially the basis for them being able to resurrect a resource that they still want to use during off hours when off hours has already happened. And that's So the visibility aspect to developers is off hours is different in that scenario because it's a property of the environment, so to speak, that's been communicated out of band, and then it's about how do they interact with that environment capability.
Super cool. I have a question. What language are the policies written in?
Policies are written in a high-level YAML DSL. We focus on conciseness and simplicity, and so that is it is several, probably order of magnitude less than, let's say, Kubernetes manifest as
You
a
said high
comparison.
level YAML
Yeah.
DSL?
Hmm.
Cool. Yeah, Fuel Snuggle said I
So
was about to guess a DSL with a focus on simplicity and what else?
simplicity and readability.
Cool. And it's slightly easier than Kubernetes YAML, you say?
At least one order of magnitude, maybe two.
Cool. So I was thinking when we write out, if you want to write out a list of benefits at all, maybe you want to spend something else on the space, but when we write the benefits, we can include the awesome community as one of them.
Yeah. So our community, I think we have several thousand people in chat. We have almost 400 contributors. As a project, we've been around since 2016. So, we've been around for a few years. I think we're forgot how many releases we've done. We typically release about once a month. Um, and those contributors, span many different organizations. We have about a dozen maintainers. All the cloud providers have done some contribution directly to Custodian over time. And we do off hours biweekly. And we have some sub communities that are in different parts or different in different foundations. So the FinOps Foundation, for example, has its own Slack, and there's roughly 3,000 people in the Cloud Custodian channel in that forum.
Wow.
We have a main Cloud Custodian Slack, which I actually don't recall how many people it has. We actually switched out last year from to Slack from a open source general an open source chat mechanism called Gitter. We had about I think so, we have about 850 people in our Slack channel today, and then I think previously in Gitter we had about 2,000. We still have people in Gitter, but we don't. It's not as actively monitored these days.
How many contributors did you say?
The exact count as of today is probably about 390, 392.
I'm gonna put
So almost
about
400.
400. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So that's one benefit of Cloud Custodian. It has amazing community. So and then it seems like flexibility in terms of what you can manage with it, maybe.
Both the type of policy and what you do with it. And remediation as that first class language with those hundreds of actions. So you can, you have a lot of flexibility with both what to find and how to do it.
Um, uh, Flexibility, I about what to find. Can we be more specific about what to find means about resource types?
About resources, let's say I'm looking at data. Like I think we've given a couple examples here, and databases that haven't been used and haven't had a connection in 2 weeks. But we might also do additional parameters like that are also tagged with this, that are also of a particular engine type, that are also of a particular version. So being that flexibility around what to find allows you a lot of power to, like, say I want to find all of my serverless functions that are using outdated runtimes, that are not in production environments. And so the ability to do arbitrary filtering gives you a lot of flexibility on what you're looking for. And then the ability to use those actions and create workflows where you chain policies together gives you a lot of flexibility on how you actually deal with remediations. We also support data integrations in our filtering. So if you want to source an exception list from a JSON file or a CSV or from a URL or object storage, we support that as well. So that allows for people to sort of crack, like the exception management tends to be buried as far as tooling within an organization. And so being able to support that flexibly meets people where they are in terms of the real world. And then, our event-based policies, being able to do real time, is, and using the same policy language is super powerful for being able to correct problems before they become actual problems.
Event-based policy supports real time, and it also supports the low compute, like low overhead compute, right?
Correct. So we typically are using the serverless runtimes for the different providers. So, from an overhead perspective, that compute has a particular cost, but the fact that we're only operating it whenever there's an event means that it's, if it's idle, it's zero cost.
So supports real-time enforcement and what's a good way to say it's cheap or it's using less compute?
Real-time enforcement via efficient-less serverless compute, I guess.
Shit. Cool. And then I think we should, in the benefits, mention the communication and human readable part. Yeah?
Yeah. Sort of coming back to where we started.
Yeah, exactly.
The ability to drive that behavior change through notifications, through a lot of rich channels, to actually, I remember changing the tag policy at an organization and spending the next 2 years explaining what everyone thought was the new tag policy to people because that knowledge hadn't been driven through the org, and so being able to automate that knowledge transfer and that behavior change is hugely important. And then just the readability, being able to be approachable to a large set of audiences, both from the different application teams, be it a front-end developer, a back-end developer, to an analyst, to an executive, in some cases I've seen, to an architect, is hugely important. Like being able, I think I've seen some challenges with other policy languages where it's a very, very specialized skill set. So like understanding what it's supposed to do is hard. And so we want to democratize that and make that as broadly available to people as possible.
What about like where do these policies live? Are they centralized? Can they be reused in different places if they're relevant in different places?
So we don't, because we want to scale from a mom and pop to enterprise, and we don't really dictate how people organize. Like we have, we have guidance and best practices, but like at the end of the day, custodian is a CLI. If I just want to operate it on my local laptop, I can. And at the same time, what we generally recommend to people is that they create a Git repository that has code reviews set up and that they submit pull requests to it. And they treat it the same way as they would any other application or infrastructure code. And then we'll source that. Custodian has built-in validation, so we can apply some of that in CI. We also have dry run capabilities, so you can sort of see what that's going to do. and then, so generally speaking, you want them to live in Git. As far as how and like what sort of compute you use to actually, run the policies, we try to be agnostic as possible, because there's always this consideration when you're dealing with open source projects that initially emerged from enterprises. They're built to Conway's Law, and we really wanted to make sure that we were as flexible as possible to the broadest audience and set of users.
Are there any other benefits you'd like to list? We have amazing community, flexibility with types of resources that can be used, and flexibility with actions you can do on those resources. We have the event-based policies with real-time and efficient serverless compute. Drive behavior change with notifications, readability.
I think the key things are all of that tied with the different the pillars that these use cases lie under. We have hundreds of examples of various security cost optimization operation stuff inside of the Cloud Custodian docs, and sort of due to the breadth and of those, it would be a little bit hard to fit them on this board. So I think we've lined up to sort of the core capabilities, the core flexibility, the core, and sort of what are the use cases that you can achieve with them from a high level.
Cool. I put a good for all four pillars of governance, helpful in all parts of development life cycle. Cool. So, do you have anything else you'd like to teach? I can find room if you want.
No, I think we've covered off on quite a lot. So I'm pretty good. Thank you for the invite as well.
Yeah, I'm going to do a recap before we say goodbye. But I just want to, and then during the recap at the end, I'll ask you if there's anything you want to add, and whether you feel proud of how your technology has been represented today. And also, if anyone in chat has any questions, now's the time. All right, so here we go. So the world before Cloud Custodian. So policy was inhibiting productivity or the implementation of policy. So it was being done a lot with like one-off scripts, which were not human readable, not necessarily centralized. It doesn't really scale. And also, organizations were just at the beginning of the cloud journey when you created Cloud Custodian. So people were really making it up as they went along. Back then, we hadn't settled on best practices. So Cloud Custodian is a rules engine that helps you manage your cloud resources. And as cloud resources is very vast, like in passing, we talked about all the different cloud providers. We talked about Terraform. We talked about Circle CI. A lot of has come up, but even Kubernetes. Cloud Custodian seems very flexible in terms of what cloud resources you can manage. But we did seem to focus on infrastructure, although you can use it to manage other things too. So Cloud Custodian policies consist of 5 things, but really 3 of them. We're going to start with 3 of them. So first is a resource. So that could be anything like an Azure VM, an AWS EC2 instance, a database. It could be, there are lots and lots of things it could be. And then you have a set of filters that you apply to that resource. And so one might be like show all non-encrypted disk volumes would be a filter. And API calls can happen as a part of that filter. So then once you have a resource and you apply filters, then you're left with some resources that have made it through the filter, and then actions can be applied to those resources. So it might be stop a VM or snapshot a disk, and really there are hundreds of possible actions. So basically you take a resource, you apply filters, and then the resulting resources have actions applied to them automatically. So the example we used of the full situation is that a databases filtered to ones that have not been connected to in 2 weeks. Those non-connected databases are stopped and an admin is notified. So that would be an example. Of course, you could not stop it and just notify the admin. You could do 100 things. You could filter it 100 ways. It's wildly flexible. So then we talked about a couple more Cloud Custodian policy, I don't know, characteristics. There we
Capabilities.
go. Capabilities, sure. So then we have the mode. So the default is the pooling mode. So it queries the control plane in pooling mode. So it queries existing resources. Or you could do an events-based mode, which is where something is triggered if something happens. So, for example, a database is created with an API call, and then it gets triggered and it's automatically tagged. So the event, so when you're referring to pooling is pooling, and event, I liked how you said events-based stuff is pushing. And so the mode really is talking about when it's getting the resource. And then we talked about a source. So the source is the default is the service API, but there are also cloud specific sources. So that is related to how you get a resource. So really, but the mode and source together make for resource discovery. And so that's the combo of those two things. And then one thing I'd like to include on the board that you said briefly is that you can chain together resources. No, chain together policies to make a
Policies.
workflow, right? I just
Yep.
want to write that down. Cool. And then, excellent. And then I have to, so that you can see it while I stand in front of it, I just have to, there we go. All right. So then, we talked about just generally speaking, not cloud custodian specific, but like what does it mean to be well managed in the cloud? And that has to do with a bigger umbrella called governance. And there are 4 pillars of good governance. First one being security. So you have access, IAM specifically, you have privilege, you have network security, you're worried about encryption as part of security. We also have operations, so making sure your system is resilient and efficient. Then there's cost optimization. So with that, we're worried about life cycles, storage, making sure all the resources that are running are being used. And then finally, we talked about compliance. And so compliance might have to do with industry regulation, like HIPAA, for example, or it might have to do with internal compliance. So which might just be like to tag every ingress with a certain tag or something to tag resources. So, and then it's worth saying that Cloud Custodian can help with all 4 of those pillars. So you can use Cloud Custodian policies at different points in your workload lifecycle. So you might want to be using it for the more infrastructure stuff, for the cloud runtime stuff. You do bring your own compute for the policies, and that's just to maintain all the flexibility that Cloud Custodian has. And you said too, it could be used for a really small mom and pop shop, or it could be scaled across ginormous enterprises. So with cloud runtime, you have it also can be efficient compute wise when you use the event-based mode because the compute's only being used in the case where something actually happens that's running in a serverless way. And then we also talked about shift left as part of the life cycle. So that can help developers or reviewers understand the best practices of their organization. So there's integration with GitHub. So if something's not passing, that all can be communicated as part of GitHub, and the reviewers and the developers can see it and understand what's not passing and why. And that gets us right into remediation. So remediation varies, like policy itself can vary a lot between organizations, and then how you want to address non-conformance can vary a lot between organizations too. And Cloud Custodian addresses that, in just like everything, in a wildly flexible way, so you can do what's specific to your organization. So if you want to alert, you can alert in real time. If you want to fix it in real time, sometimes that can happen. Maybe you only send a reminder like, hey, this is wrong, just to let you know. We're going to let it through, but you can do better. Or maybe you set a time limit before an action happens. Like, okay, this database doesn't comply, but we'll give you a month to fix it. And after a month, then the action happens. Well, the important part here is that communication is key, and with Cloud Custodian, you can communicate every step of the way and take advantage of these teachable moments in a way that's very human readable. So we talked about a specific Cloud Custodian use case where you might want to set up off hours policies in dev and test environments. Excuse me. So you basically want these environments to go away when they're during off hours. So you would define resources to say like what exactly is going to go away when it's going to during off hours, and you define filters, which would say what exactly off hours look like. You can customize for different time zones. You can also allow folks to opt in and out with tags. Maybe some teams just don't want to participate. Maybe someone wants to work late and they need to be able to access their environments. They can do policy exceptions with tags. But otherwise, if you can set it up to just totally turn that stuff off during off hours and save your organization a lot of money. Policies are written in a high-level YAML DSL. DSL stands for domain-specific language. And it's a focus on readability and simplicity. And you can also chain together policies to make a workflow. So then our benefits, we have Cloud Custodian has an amazing community with over almost 400 contributors, and also huge Slack. You said 3,000 people, I believe, in the Slack workspace. And I've been around to recruit a guest, you as my guest, and everyone's super nice in the Cloud Custodian workspace for sure. There's flexibility about what types of resources can be used. So we talked about tons of flexibility about what filters can be used. There are hundreds of actions, and it supports data integration. So if you want to say, I'm guessing here, it has to be in this name. The namespace has to be one of this list of 100 namespaces. It has to be in one of those, so you can bring data in to help filter your stuff. Event-based policies, so that supports the real-time enforcement, and it also, since it's run in serverless, it's a very cost-effective way to do policy, because some of policy in general, when there's so many things to concern about, it can be high compute and expensive. So that's a good way to be efficient with your money, and it can drive behavior change. It has great readability. It's good for all 4 pillars of governance, and it's helpful at all the points in the development lifecycle. And
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's a great summary.
You feel happy with it? Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, that's fantastic. I think you hit the highlights. Maybe next time you present.
Excellent. If I ever win a pinch and need to tell, actually, it'll be so I do another show called You Choose, which is a choose your own adventure through the CNCF landscape. And so it's a streaming show, but also we make that into a live demo and like a conference talk. So if and when I do a security conference talk as a choose your own adventure, I will be talking about Cloud Custodian probably in a public way. That's a good 6 months down the line. But I hope to represent you well. And we have some lovely comments. We have a live coding, came out of lurk mode to say your voice is dying. Take care of yourself and be well. Thank you. I'll drink a lot of water after this show. And then AJ's here to say great tour and solid board craft. Wow, thanks. Thank you. Thanks for coming and thanks for saying hello. So the thing we do to say goodbye, I'm going to replay the intro music and we're just going to dance a little bit and wave our goodbyes. How do you feel about that? You ready for it? You can just move your shoulders if you're not too comfortable. Yeah, there you go. Let me get the music going. I love how you're so ready though. Yeah, goodbye everyone. Thank you so much for spending your Friday with us. And thanks to those who watch the recordings. Yeah. We're gonna let the bass drop. Here we are. Yeah. Okay, bye.